She was 93 years old, lived alone on a piece of land that had been in her family for more than a century, and every morning she still made her coffee the same way, black, strong, and quiet. But that morning, something felt different. There's a kind of stillness that settles over a place right before everything changes. The kind that makes birds stop singing and wind hold its breath. That stillness covered the Miller farm like a blanket. And in that stillness, Rose Miller, daughter of pioneers, widow of a war veteran, mother, grandmother, stood on her porch and stared out across the valley she had protected her whole life. Something was coming. She could feel it in her bones. And this time, it wasn't a storm or a bad harvest. This was human, dangerous, ruthless. Whispering Pines was the kind of town people forgot. Tucked away in the mountains of Montana, it was a speck on the map, the sort of place where folks knew how many sugar cubes you liked in your coffee and when your roof needed fixing before you did. No chain stores, no big city problems, just weathered buildings, generations-deep friendships, and land, miles and miles of open land. It was peaceful, but not sleepy. There was a quiet strength in its people, the kind that didn't shout or show off, but stood firm when tested. And Rose Miller? She was the very soul of that strength. The kind of woman who could tell the time of year by how the light hit the barn, who could spot a liar in church by how they held their hymn book. She'd lived through wars, watched her husband go off to one, buried him years later under the tree where he proposed. She'd raised a daughter, watched her leave and come back, and helped raise a grandson who had gone on to become something more than anyone expected. But even with all that behind her, even with a life full of stories that could fill books, Rose had never seen anything quite like what was coming down her driveway. For months, the signs had been there, subtle shifts in the town's rhythm, new faces appearing in town, unfamiliar trucks idling too long outside the diner, locals whispering about offers on their land that came with smiles too wide and contracts too vague. A few folks had taken the money, others hadn't been given the choice. Fires started accidentally, equipment was vandalized, permits revoked for reasons no one could explain. And the ones who complained, they stopped complaining real quick. Rose had seen this sort of thing before, though not quite like this. She'd seen the slow infection of greed, the way it crept in wearing nice suits and promising progress. But the truth always came out in the end. And this truth had a name, the Steel Riders. They didn't look like a gang, not in the traditional sense. They looked like developers, investors. They showed up in town driving shiny black SUVs, wearing tailored clothes and smug grins, throwing around phrases like urban expansion and revitalization. But underneath that gloss, there was something else, something cold and practiced. They weren't buying land, they were claiming it. And Rose's farm, sitting on the highest ridge in the county with views for miles in every direction, was the crown jewel. What they didn't know was who they were trying to steal it from. That morning, when the frost clung to the tips of the grass like silver threads, and the sky turned from dark purple to pale gold, Rose stood alone on her porch and sipped her coffee, watching the sun rise over the land she'd spent her entire life protecting. She didn't shake. She didn't flinch. But inside she knew. This was the day the line would be drawn. Not in the dirt, but in principle. And if they thought she was going to be easy to scare, they'd misunderstood everything about her. Because there are two things you don't do in Montana. One, you don't come between a woman and her land. And two, you never threaten someone who has nothing left to lose and everything left to fight for. The sound came first, a low, distant hum that didn't belong. Rose Miller knew every creak of her barn, every rustle of wind through the trees, every call of the hawks that circled above her fields. But this was foreign. The growl of powerful engines climbing the gravel road up to her home, too smooth, too synchronized to be delivery trucks or neighbors. It was the kind of sound that made the hairs on your neck stand up before your mind even processed why. By the time the first SUV crested the hill and came into view, Rose had already set her coffee cup down on the porch railing and folded her hands in front of her. She didn't move, didn't blink. She just watched. 3 black vehicles, identical down to the tinted windows and spotless exteriors, moved in formation like a convoy, silent except for the crunch of gravel under tires. They didn't belong here. They never had. The lead SUV rolled to a stop, and the doors opened in near-perfect unison. Out stepped Marcus Stone, every inch of him polished, expensive, and out of place. He wore a fitted navy suit and leather shoes that had never seen dirt until today, his hair cut sharp, his face set in a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. Behind him, 2 men stepped out of the other vehicles, silent, alert, and wide-shouldered. They wore casual clothes, but Rose recognized their type. Military, maybe former, maybe not. It was in the way they scanned the property without moving their heads, the way they kept their arms loose but ready. These weren't assistants. These were enforcers. Marcus walked up to the edge of the porch, the gravel crunching beneath each slow, deliberate step. "Mrs. Miller," he called out, voice smooth like honey over glass. "Beautiful morning, isn't it? Thought we might stop by for a quick conversation." Rose didn't respond at first. She let the silence stretch, just long enough to remind him that he was the guest here, even if he didn't act like it. Finally, she nodded once. "You're back again," she said flatly. "You must think I didn't mean it the first time." He laughed, a soft, performative chuckle meant to disarm. "Now come on, let's not be adversaries. This isn't a fight, it's an opportunity. You've got an incredible piece of land here. Historic, really. We're willing to make a very generous offer. You'd be doing the town a favor, stepping aside for progress." Rose didn't move from her place. "Progress," she repeated, tasting the word like something sour. "Is that what you call it when you threaten my neighbors? When you cut fences and light barns on fire in the middle of the night? When you send city boys to scare old men into signing papers they can't read?" Marcus tilted his head, smile still fixed in place, but now with a hint of tightness at the corners. "I think you've been misinformed. My team is only here to facilitate growth. That's all." He gestured to the vast stretch of land behind her as if he already owned it. "This place has potential. Developers are interested. You could retire in comfort, travel, get out of the cold. You've done your part, Mrs. Miller. Let the next generation take it from here." She narrowed her eyes, voice low and even. "My part was building this land up from nothing with my husband, raising my daughter in a 2-room house with no heat, teaching my grandson to shoot a rifle and plant a row straight. You think you're the next generation? You think you've earned anything here?" Her gaze sharpened. "You're just a wolf in a suit." The smile disappeared completely then, replaced by a thin line of calculation. Marcus stepped forward, placing 1 foot on the bottom step of her porch. "You don't want this to go the hard way," he said, the warmth gone from his voice. "You're alone out here. Accidents happen. Farms are dangerous, and no one wants to see anything unfortunate." For a moment, neither of them moved. The wind stirred through the trees behind the farmhouse, rustling leaves like whispered warnings. Rose didn't flinch. "I've faced down worse men than you," she said simply, "and you just made 2 mistakes." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Is that right? And what would those be?" "First," she said, nodding toward the window behind her, "you assumed I was alone." The glint of sunlight caught the polished barrel of a hunting rifle leaned in plain view, angled deliberately. Marcus's men stiffened, their hands twitching instinctively toward their concealed weapons. "And the second?" he asked, voice cold now. Rose met his stare with a calm steel of her own. "You assumed I didn't know exactly what you are." That was when something in Marcus's face shifted, a flicker of doubt, of discomfort. He had expected fear, expected trembling, but what he found was an old woman who stared him down like a soldier on a battlefield, someone who had buried more friends than he could count, someone who had already lost everything once and wasn't about to do it again without a fight. And deep down, under all his polish and practiced lines, Marcus Stone felt something he hadn't felt in years. Uncertainty. He took a slow step back, adjusted his jacket, and forced a smile that no longer held any charm. "Think about our offer, Mrs. Miller. You've got a limited window. Change is coming, whether you want it or not." Then he turned and walked back to his vehicle. His men followed, eyes still scanning, not with confidence, but with suspicion. They weren't just observing anymore. They were looking for the threat they'd failed to anticipate. Rose waited until the last SUV rolled down the drive and disappeared behind the trees. Only then did she exhale, not out of fear, but because she knew what had just happened. The first shot of a war had been fired, and they had no idea who they were dealing with. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't peace that settled over it. It was the kind of silence that feels like it's waiting for something. Rose Miller stood just inside her screen door, her hand resting on the frame, her eyes fixed on the empty gravel road where the black SUVs had disappeared moments earlier. She didn't move, didn't blink. It was as if she were watching something no one else could see. Memories, maybe, or possibilities. She had seen enough men like Marcus Stone in her lifetime to know one thing for certain. He would be back. And the next time, he wouldn't come to talk. He'd come to take. And maybe it would be in the dead of night. Maybe it would be loud and violent. Or maybe it would be quiet. A few cuts to a fence line, a torch to the barn, a sudden disappearance no one could prove. That's how his kind worked. Smiles first, threats second, fire last. She walked slowly to the old desk in the front room. It still bore the scratches from when her daughter spilled ink in 3rd grade, still had a drawer that stuck when it rained. Rose opened the top drawer and pulled out a small flip phone, ancient by most standards, but perfectly functional. It was the kind of phone you kept for only one reason: reliability. She'd charged it every month, tested the line, kept it wrapped in a dish towel beneath old receipts and oil bills. It had one number saved, a number she had memorized not just in her head, but in her bones. She held the phone in her hand, thumb hovering over the call button. There was a moment, just a second, where she hesitated. Not out of fear. No, that wasn't it. It was something else. Calling him meant admitting that things were no longer manageable on her own. It meant she had to bring him back into something he'd left behind for good reason. She didn't want that. She didn't want him back in this world, with its danger and shadow games. But it was already too late for that. The moment Marcus Stone put his foot on her porch, this stopped being about her pride and started being about survival. Not just hers, but the town's. She hit send. 2 rings. That's all it took. Then a voice, steady, strong, and unmistakable. "Gran?" She didn't respond right away. She just listened to the sound of his voice, let it fill the room like sunlight after a long winter. Then she said, "Jack, I think it's time." Silence on the other end. Not confusion, not surprise, just silence. Then a shift, a subtle change in tone. When he spoke again, the warmth was still there, but now there was something underneath it, an edge. "What happened?" "The same men who've been pushing people out of town," she said, her voice calm but direct. "They came to the house today. They want the land. They're not asking anymore." "Did they touch you?" "Number. But they will. Not yet, but soon." Jack didn't ask any more questions. He didn't need to. He trusted her judgment like he trusted few things in this world. If she said it was serious, then it was serious. "I'll be there as fast as I can." "Bring what you need," she said. "This isn't just about me. It's bigger." Jack's voice dropped to a tone she remembered from his last deployment. "I figured." When the call ended, Rose placed the phone gently back on the table. Her hand lingered over it for a moment, then she walked to the kitchen, poured the rest of her coffee down the sink, and set the mug in the dish rack. There were things to prepare. Hundreds of miles away, in a secure briefing room on the East Coast, Jack Miller stood up from his chair, his jaw set, his demeanor transformed. Just minutes before, he'd been in a planning session, reviewing operations in the Middle East, talking strategy, resources, timelines. But now, everything had changed. He walked out of the room without a word, heading straight to the team bay. One of his fellow SEALs, David Walker, a longtime teammate and close friend, fell into step beside him. "What's up?" David asked, instantly recognizing the shift in Jack's energy. "Is it her?" Jack didn't slow down. "Steel Riders. They just paid her a visit." David's expression darkened immediately. "That gang out of Colorado? I thought they were still small-time muscle for hire." "They were. Not anymore. They're building something bigger, and it's spreading." "Who leads them now?" "Guy named Marcus Stone. Used to work private security in South America. Real slick. Cartel ties." David didn't need to hear more. "When do we leave?" "Now. I'm taking emergency leave." The process was swift. Jack's commanding officer saw the look in his eyes and didn't ask many questions. Family emergency was all it took. When a SEAL asked for leave under that reason, no one hesitated. Jack and David hit the road within the hour. They didn't waste time with flights or delays. They drove, a long, quiet haul across the country, switching off at gas stations and rest stops. No music, no distractions, just the steady hum of wheels on asphalt and the occasional buzz of incoming intelligence from contacts they'd called along the way. By the time they crossed the Montana border, the mission was already taking shape. This wasn't going to be a reunion. This wasn't a vacation. This was war. Not the kind with drones and missiles, but a more personal kind. The kind that happened in the shadows, in quiet towns where good people got pushed into silence. Jack Miller had been trained to fight in some of the most dangerous places in the world. He'd operated behind enemy lines, led missions that were never acknowledged, saved lives that would never know his name. But none of that mattered now, because this wasn't about medals or missions. This was about home, and someone had threatened his grandmother. That was all it took. The first thing Jack noticed when they rolled into Whispering Pines wasn't what had changed, but what hadn't. The mountains still loomed like sleeping giants in the distance. The pine trees still lined the roads like silent sentinels, and the sun still set behind the ridge in a blaze of orange and fire that painted the whole valley gold. It looked like home. But beneath that postcard view, something was wrong. Deeply wrong. It was in the way people moved, the way the town breathed, in the silence that fell when strangers walked into a room, in the empty chairs outside the barber shop that used to be filled with old men telling older stories, in the downcast eyes at the gas station, and the way the clerk didn't ask how their trip had been. Whispering Pines had been changed, not by nature, not by time, but by fear, and Jack felt it like a weight settling on his chest. They drove slowly down Main Street, past shuttered storefronts and fading for sale signs in windows that used to glow with life. Bill Anderson's diner still stood on the corner, somehow unchanged, but even there, the cheerful clatter of plates and coffee mugs seemed muted. Jack clocked at least 3 new security cameras mounted to utility poles, the kind small towns didn't buy unless someone else paid for them. Most people would have missed them. Jack didn't. He also didn't miss the black sedan parked just far enough off Main Street to look casual, or the 2 men inside wearing mirrored sunglasses despite the overcast sky. He and David exchanged a glance. They were being watched. The deeper they moved into town, the more the signs stacked up. Trucks with out-of-state plates idled near the courthouse. Buildings that should have been condemned had been suddenly and recently renovated. Construction sites with no real work happening. It was too clean, too orchestrated. Someone had scrubbed this town and left the smell of bleach behind, and everyone knew it. Jack guided the truck toward the sheriff's department first, not the farm, not yet. He needed eyes on the ground, allies, if there were any left. The red brick building looked the same from the outside, but the inside felt different, quieter, more sterile, less human. Sheriff Linda Cooper stood up from her desk as soon as he walked in. A wave of relief passed over her face that she didn't bother to hide. "Jack Miller," she said, walking around her desk to shake his hand. "About time you showed up." Jack gave a nod. "How bad is it?" Linda's face tightened. She didn't mince words. Worse than your grandmother's letting on. This whole town's being swallowed one bite at a time. Steel riders moved in under the guise of a real estate group, offering money for land, development contracts, business investments. When people said no, they didn't ask twice. They burned down the Reeves' barn. They ran the Thompsons off their property, called it an accident, and no one could prove a thing. David leaned against the wall, arms crossed, listening. "And the county officials?" Jack asked, though he already had a good guess. Linda scoffed. "Half of them are in Marcus Stone's pocket. Thomas Bennett's the worst. He blocks every investigation, calls it harassment of legitimate businessmen. I've lost 3 good deputies. 1 resigned, 2 reassigned to desk duty. I'm down to a skeleton crew, and they're watching me like hawks." David stepped forward. "They've militarized the takeover." Linda nodded grimly. "They're not bikers anymore, Jack. They're organized, trained. Some of them move like ex-special forces. They keep everything legal enough on paper to avoid full federal attention, but underneath it all, they're running drugs, laundering money, and turning this town into a hub for something bigger." Jack walked over to a map on the wall, an incident board with pins stuck through the county. These patterns, they're building a corridor. Control the roads, control the land, control the people. Linda joined him. "Your grandmother's farm is the last piece. It backs up to federal land, sits on high ground, and has sightlines to 3 major routes. If they get it, they'll have a clean highway north, straight through to Canada." Jack traced the map with his finger. "They're not just buying land. They're building a supply line, using this town as cover." "And no one's stopping them," Linda said, her voice low and hard. "The feds won't touch it without hard evidence, and the locals are too scared to speak." Jack turned away from the board, his eyes sharp. "Then we'll give them what they need." As they left the sheriff's office, Linda stopped him with one last piece of advice. "Be careful, Jack. These aren't the usual troublemakers. Stone's people, they're professionals, and if you start poking around, they'll know. They always know." Jack looked her in the eye. "So do we." They drove the last few miles to the Miller farm in silence, the kind of silence that says more than words. The house came into view just as the sky began to dim into evening, porch light already on. Rose was waiting, standing exactly where Jack knew she would be, arms crossed, back straight, face unreadable. He stepped out of the truck and walked up the path. She didn't rush. She didn't hug him. She simply said, "You made good time." Jack nodded. "Didn't stop for coffee." Her eyes scanned his face. "Brought help?" He motioned toward David, who was already unloading gear. "You remember David Walker?" "Course I do," she said with a slight smile. "He's the one who used to sneak my cherry pie into your rucksack." David grinned as he walked up. "Still your best weapon, Mrs. Miller." Rose's smile faded as her eyes drifted toward the tree line. "They've been watching the house. Probably know you're here already." "Good," Jack said, his voice calm but sharp. "Let them watch." From the shadows beyond the trees, headlights flashed once, brief and deliberate. Someone was watching, just like she said, but they weren't the only ones. Jack had returned, not just to protect the farm, but to expose everything hiding beneath the surface of Whispering Pines. And now that the board was set, it was only a matter of time before the game began. And this time, the rules had changed. Jack sat at the old kitchen table, the same one he'd eaten pancakes on as a boy, tracing a finger over the wood grain worn smooth by decades of use. Rose poured coffee into his mug, black and scalding hot, the way he always drank it. No one spoke for a moment, not because there was nothing to say, but because both of them understood the weight of what was coming. Finally, Rose broke the silence. "They want this place, Jack, not just because it's mine, not just to hurt me. They need it." Jack nodded slowly. "I know. We saw the maps. David ran some satellite scans. You're sitting on the last stretch of high ground before the land dips into the interstate corridors. From this ridge, you can see everything. Back roads, logging trails, even that old service route by the creek. It's not just a farm anymore. It's a keyhole. Rose didn't flinch. Then they're never getting it. It wasn't just pride that fueled her defiance. It was instinct, a sense that this wasn't just a local power play or some desperate grab for real estate. This was infrastructure, strategic, something much darker. Jack pulled a folded blueprint from his bag and spread it across the table. He pointed to a cluster of red dots. They've bought up nearly everything from the old rail yard to the West Highway. Properties under different shell companies, all of them recently transferred. Most of the names on the deeds trace back to holdings in Colorado and Nevada, where cartel presence has been active for years. They're not just settling here, they're expanding. Rose studied the map carefully. And this place sits right in the middle. Jack nodded. You've got two things they need: elevation and access. From this farm, they can set up surveillance on every major in-and-out route for 50 miles. They're not planning some small-time operation, Gran. They're building a corridor, a distribution line for something big. David walked in from the back porch, a folder in one hand and an expression that confirmed what Jack had feared. We just got confirmation from Maria Santos, the investigative journalist out of Bozeman. She's been tracking property grabs like this in 3 other counties. Every time it starts the same. A few offers on land, pressure tactics, scare jobs, then a sudden boom in construction that doesn't match the supposed zoning. And every time it ends the same: drugs, violence, federal interest and silence. Jack looked up. Who's backing them? David shook his head. That's the thing, no clear names, but the paper trail leads to a trust fund that shares legal counsel with a firm that's been under DEA scrutiny for laundering cartel money through development projects. It's always the same pattern. They hide behind LLCs, make things look legitimate. By the time anyone realizes what's going on, the town's already sold, and the network's already built. Rose didn't need to hear any more. She walked to the window, arms crossed as she looked out over the land she'd worked her entire life. Her voice was steady. They think they're building something new, but they've built it on lies and fear, and they've forgotten what this place really is. It's not just dirt and wood and fences, it's ours. The truth was undeniable now. Marcus Stone and his steel riders weren't just strong-arming locals for a cash grab. They were laying the groundwork for something far more dangerous. With access to this farm, they could complete a northbound route that linked Colorado and Wyoming operations to the Canadian border. Safe passage for whatever the highest bidder wanted to move. Drugs, weapons, people, and Whispering Pines would become the linchpin in an invisible empire no one even realized was being built. That was the real reason they needed Rose's farm. It wasn't about land value or modernization. It was about control. Jack looked over the data again, jaw tightening. They're already running shipments, just small ones, testing the water. But once this land flips, they'll scale fast. You'll see blacked-out trucks moving through logging roads at night. New fences going up, patrols. It'll all look like development until someone asks the wrong question. David tapped a page on the file. And it's not just the roads. There's a decommissioned comms relay just over the ridge, linked to federal land. They get their hands on that. They've got a full encrypted relay point for long-range coordination. No one would think twice. It's listed as inactive, but with the right tech, it's a secure node for cartel comms. Everything fit, too well, too neatly. Jack leaned back, the chair creaking beneath him. They've thought this through. They're not just thugs. They've got lawyers, planners, IT infrastructure, corrupt officials. This is a network, and Whispering Pines is one hub in a much larger wheel. Rose stepped away from the window and sat down, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes sharp as ever. Then we break the wheel, before it finishes turning. Jack felt that old sense stirring inside him again, the one he hadn't felt since his last deployment. The sense that he wasn't just here to protect, but to dismantle, to fight not a battle, but a strategy. And this time, it was personal. First, we get eyes everywhere. They're watching us, but we'll watch them harder. Second, we gather every local still willing to stand. Even one voice matters. And third, when they make their move, we're going to be ready. Not just to defend, to expose. David nodded. Maria's working on a story. She wants evidence. Video, documents, testimony. We get that. And we don't just stop this operation. We unravel their entire network. Rose stood, her voice steady. Then let's start. I've got fences to check, neighbors to call, and a shotgun to oil. They think they're building something big. Let's show them what we've been building all along. From that moment on, the Miller farm wasn't just a home. It was ground zero, a line in the sand, and the first place in a long time that someone had told the Steel Riders no, and meant it. In every war, there are those who fight with weapons and those who fight with will, and in Whispering Pines, that line was beginning to blur. Jack had expected to find fear, expected to find a town with its head down, too broken to push back. What he found instead was something deeper, quieter, not resistance, not yet, but the flicker of it, like embers hidden in ash, waiting for someone to breathe life into the flame. And that flame had a name now. It was spreading, one conversation at a time, one locked glance between neighbors, one nod at the diner, one set jaw on a face that used to flinch. Whispering Pines hadn't died. It had gone underground, waiting for someone to give it permission to stand back up. It started with Bill Anderson. Jack found him behind the counter of his diner, wiping down the same counter he'd worked since his father ran the place. Bill had always been the unofficial town anchor, everyone's friend, everyone's confidant, but now he looked thinner, older. Jack sat at the counter, ordered coffee without saying a word, and watched the man pour it with hands that didn't quite shake, but came close. "I heard you were back," Bill said eventually, not looking up. "Your gran okay?" "For now," Jack replied. "I hear the town's not." Bill gave a short, dry laugh. "Town stopped being okay 6 months ago. First, it was the offers. Big money, no strings, too good to be true. Then it was the pressure. Permits revoked, trucks keyed, crops burned. Same story, different farms. Then people started disappearing." Jack kept his voice even. "Who?" "Reeves' family. Packed up and left in the middle of the night. Said it was health reasons, but I saw the fear in their eyes. The Thompsons got run off their own land. Then there's Frank Carter. Owned the supply yard. They found his place trashed, office torched. Fire report said electrical. Everyone knows that's a lie." Jack didn't ask if the police were involved. He already knew the answer. Why haven't people pushed back? Bill finally looked up. Because every time someone stands up, something happens. A fire, a break-in, a flat tire on a mountain road in the middle of the night with no signal and no one around. This town's full of good people, Jack. But good people get tired. Good people get scared. We're not trained like you. We're not armed. We're farmers, mechanics, store clerks. They didn't beat us with violence. They beat us with silence. Jack stared into his coffee. That ends now. The next visit was to Mike Foster, who ran the only working garage left in town. Mike had always been solid, a Vietnam vet with calloused hands, a deep laugh, and a back so bad it crackled when he stood. Jack found him under a truck, sleeves rolled, grease staining his arms. When Jack called his name, Mike rolled out from beneath the chassis and squinted. "I'll be damned," he said. "Did Rose finally make that call?" Jack nodded. "It's time." Mike stood, cracked his back, and wiped his hands on an oily rag. "Good. Was wondering how long she'd wait." "You still got the service van?" "Runs like hell, but yeah." Jack leaned in. "You still know how to wire cameras?" Mike raised an eyebrow. "You asking for hypothetical reasons?" "Nope." A slow grin spread across Mike's face. "Then I suppose I still know a few tricks." By sundown, 6 new sets of eyes were watching the town. Covert cameras hidden in old fence posts, bird feeders, hollowed-out porch lamps. David coordinated the feed from the spare room in the Miller farmhouse, screens flickering with motion-triggered alerts from Main Street to the outskirts. It was a start, a small one, but it was enough. Jenny Thompson was next. Her family had owned the general store since the 1950s, but now it was barely staying open. Jack approached her cautiously. He remembered her from school, fierce even then. She stood behind the register with a baseball bat leaning against the wall and a revolver under the counter. She didn't blink when Jack walked in, just nodded and rang up a pack of batteries he didn't need. "Heard what you're doing," she said flatly. Jack didn't play coy. "You in?" Her eyes didn't waver. "They tried to buy me out, told me I'd be doing the town a favor. Then someone broke into my house and poisoned my dog. Didn't say a word. Didn't have to. I'm in." She passed him a sealed manila envelope as he turned to go. Invoices, receipts, weird bank transfers, all tied to their shell companies. Thought someone might want to take a look. Back at the farm, David flipped through the documents, eyes narrowing. "She's not just in, she's dangerous. This is good, real good. Ties Bennett to 4 different front companies. If we can match these with surveillance footage, we've got enough to draw blood." Word traveled faster than Jack expected. By the end of the week, Rose's front porch looked like a parade of quiet defiance. People stopped by under the pretense of checking her plumbing, fixing a gate, dropping off pie, but they didn't come empty-handed. They brought flash drives, journals, security footage, accounts of threats, fires, and buyouts, and they brought something else too, resolve, the kind that spread like wildfire through a dry field. The steel riders noticed. Of course they did. They always did. Black SUVs started parking a little closer. Men with buzz cuts and no names began lingering longer near the town square. Drones started appearing overhead, small, quiet, and far too expensive for investors. But it didn't stop anyone. If anything, it galvanized them. Because the more obvious the intimidation became, the clearer the line between good and evil looked. And once a line like that is drawn, a small town like Whispering Pines doesn't forget which side they stand on. The town didn't rise up all at once. There were no speeches, no rallies, no waving flags. But the resistance was unmistakable. Jenny refused to close her store. Mike refused to stop fixing sabotage trucks for free. Bill kept his diner open an hour later every night and turned off the music so people could talk freely in hushed tones. It was subtle, it was careful, but it was happening. And the Steel Riders, for all their money and training, didn't understand one thing. They were trying to take over a town that had nothing left to lose. And those are the towns that fight the hardest. Jack stood at the edge of the Miller farm one night, watching the tree line beyond the property. Somewhere in that darkness, men watched him. Trained men, dangerous men. But Jack didn't move, because he knew something they didn't. He wasn't alone anymore. And the town. It had just remembered how to fight. The first shot wasn't fired with a gun. It came with a letter. A thick, official-looking envelope slid under Rose Miller's front door just after dawn. No knock, no car, no witnesses. Just the letter, placed with quiet precision, stamped from the county development office. Inside, a notice of environmental violations, code infractions, and an order to suspend all farming activity on her land pending investigation. Rose read it once, slowly, without blinking. Then she set it down, folded her hands, and waited. The war had entered a new phase. Jack scanned the letter with narrowed eyes. They're moving faster now. This isn't a scare tactic. This is strategic. Legal pressure. They're trying to tie us up, slow us down. David tossed another folder onto the growing pile on the kitchen table. They just hit Jenny with a backdated tax audit. Mike got a fire inspection warning, even though his shop doesn't have a furnace. Bill's diner got a visit from a health inspector who cited him for atmospheric violations. Whatever that means. They're not attacking the land anymore, Jack said. They're attacking the people. Rose leaned back in her chair, her face unreadable. They want us isolated. They want to remind us we don't have power, that if we push back, they can reach into our lives any time they want. But they're making a mistake. David looked up. What mistake? Rose stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the valley. They think they're dealing with a single town, but what they've built is a trail of enemies, and we've got every reason to make them regret it. That afternoon, Maria Santos returned to Whispering Pines. The award-winning journalist had stayed quiet during the early days, watching, documenting, piecing together the web of influence stretching from Colorado to Montana. Now she brought with her the kind of weapons the Steel Riders couldn't fight: evidence, exposure, and the national spotlight. Jack met her at Bill's Diner. The back booth had become their unofficial operations center. She slid a hard drive across the table, wrapped in a napkin. "It's all here. Property transfers, bank records, offshore accounts. They've been laundering money through agricultural subsidies and fake infrastructure grants. The kicker? The signatures approving the permits, they're traced to Bennett's office." Jack opened the folder, flipping through the files. "You got this how?" "I made some calls. Let's just say there are still people in state government who believe in the law." David leaned over her shoulder. "And the feds?" Maria nodded. "They're watching. DEA, FBI, even the IRS has a task force keeping tabs, but they're all waiting for a clean shot. Something undeniable." Jack's voice dropped low. "Then we give it to them." The next few days became a blur of coordination. Jack and David mapped every inch of the farm's perimeter, reinforcing fences, setting motion sensors, and establishing fallback points. They installed signal jammers hidden in old water pumps to disrupt drone surveillance. David set up encrypted communications with friendly law enforcement contacts out of state, keeping them informed and out of reach from Bennett's influence. Meanwhile, Maria turned Bill's Diner into a safe house for truth. Witnesses came quietly, mostly at night: farmers, ranchers, mechanics, even a few town clerks. They spoke in hushed tones, signed sworn affidavits, and handed over damning evidence. Maria documented it all, storing copies in multiple cloud drives and shipping hard copies out of state. She knew what she was gathering was dangerous, but the more she uncovered, the more determined she became. Because this wasn't just about land grabs anymore. This was organized criminal enterprise at a national scale, hiding in plain sight. Word began to spread, not just across town, but across counties. Jack started getting encrypted messages from people he didn't know: sheriffs from other towns, private investigators, even a retired federal agent who offered to review Maria's findings for free. People who had seen this pattern before, people who had been forced out, silenced, threatened. And now, thanks to a stubborn old woman and a Navy SEAL grandson, they saw a crack in the wall. But cracks come with consequences. One night, just after midnight, a truck exploded outside Mike Foster's garage. No warning, no one hurt, just a message. The next morning, Sheriff Linda Cooper arrived at the farm, her cruiser dusty from the mountain road, her face pale. "They've gone loud," she said. "My deputy got jumped outside his home last night. Nothing stolen, just a warning. He's leaving the force. I'm down to 2 people I can trust. I don't know how much longer I can hold this together." Jack handed her a USB. "Send this to every federal agency contact you have. Tell them if anything happens to any of us, this goes wide." Linda didn't ask what was on the drive. She didn't need to. "They're scared," she said. "That's why they're getting violent." "Good," Rose said from the porch, her voice steady. "It means they're feeling the pressure." But pressure cuts both ways. That afternoon, Thomas Bennett made his move. He arrived at the farm in a black town car, flanked by 2 state troopers. Rose met him on the porch with a pot of coffee and 2 cups. She didn't invite him in. "Mrs. Miller," he began, tone oozing manufactured concern, "there's a lot of tension in the county right now. We're trying to calm things down, make sure no one gets hurt. But you've become a symbol of resistance, and symbols are dangerous." Rose poured herself coffee. "You here to threaten me, Mr. Bennett?" He smiled like a politician at a press conference. No, just a friendly warning. There's going to be a vote at the next commission meeting, emergency zoning amendments. If passed, it'll give us authority to seize land deemed critical to public infrastructure. Eminent domain. Your farm's on the list." Rose sipped her coffee. "You're calling it progress. I'm calling it theft." "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Bennett said, rising. "Sell now. Walk away rich. Stay and, well, accidents happen." Jack stepped onto the porch from inside the house, silent and sudden. His presence froze Bennett mid-step. "We're done here," Jack said. "You come back without a warrant, you won't leave with your suit intact." Bennett's eyes darted from Jack to Rose, then to the troopers. "We'll be seeing you again," he said, voice clipped. Rose raised her mug. "I'll leave the light on." That night, the farm lit up like a fortress, every motion light triggered, every perimeter camera activated. And through it all, Rose sat on her porch with a shotgun across her lap and Jack by her side, eyes scanning the horizon. The Steel Riders had started this game with money, influence, and fear. Now they were facing something far more dangerous, a town that had remembered how to stand, and a family that had never learned how to back down. It started with a rumble in the distance, low, steady, and out of place in the quiet Montana morning. Rose heard it before she saw them. She was already dressed, already sipping her second cup of coffee on the porch. Her hands were steady, her mind even more so. The rumble grew louder. Gravel shifted, dust rose. Then the first black SUV crested the hill, followed by another and then a third. 6 vehicles in total, unmarked, identical, and moving with the precision of a military convoy. They didn't roar up the driveway this time. They rolled in slow, controlled, deliberate. This wasn't intimidation anymore. It was an operation. From the upstairs window, Jack watched the lead vehicle come to a stop near the gate. Doors opened in perfect sync. Men stepped out, 3 per car, dressed in neutral tactical wear, not leather jackets or denim. These weren't gang members. These were hired guns, private contractors, ex-military, maybe special forces, brought in for cleanup, which meant Marcus Stone wasn't just escalating. He was preparing for war. David was already in the barn, eyes on the surveillance feeds, radio open to the sheriff's channel, and his sidearm within arm's reach. They'd spent the last 3 days building layers of defenses, motion-triggered lights, camouflaged cameras, silent alarms. But today, it wasn't about staying hidden. It was about being seen. Jack stepped out onto the porch beside his grandmother, dressed in tactical gear, rifle slung low across his chest. He didn't raise the weapon, not yet. He didn't have to. His presence alone changed the atmosphere. The contractors stopped in their tracks. They hadn't expected this. They'd been briefed on an old woman, maybe some angry neighbors. Not a decorated Navy SEAL standing at the top of a porch like a soldier guarding a forward operating base. One man stepped forward, sunglasses, short hair, the kind of stillness in his stance that marked years of training. His voice was calm, professional. "We're here to make a final offer." Jack didn't blink. "Not interested." The man smiled thinly. "You don't want this to escalate." Jack stepped down one stair. "You already did." Behind him, Rose stood like a statue, quiet, poised, and utterly unafraid. The man looked past Jack at her. "Ma'am, I strongly advise you reconsider. Our client is done negotiating." Rose's answer was simple. "Then your client's going to be very disappointed." The standoff lasted another minute, maybe less. Then the men returned to their vehicles. They didn't slam doors or peel out. They backed out slow, retreating without retreating. Their message left hanging in the dust. This isn't over. Once the SUVs disappeared over the ridge, Jack turned to David on the comms. "They're testing our response time, counting cameras, mapping angles." David's voice crackled in. "They're professionals. Hired recon team, not enforcers." That was the prelude. Linda Cooper confirmed it within the hour. Over scrambled radio, she reported a spike in encrypted traffic coming from the Steel Riders compound. Communications with out-of-state nodes, long-range relays lighting up. "They're calling in reinforcements," she said. I've seen this before. This is preparation for something big." At the diner, Maria Santos sorted through a stack of new documents. Overnight, someone had leaked a hard drive onto a whistleblower site. Company ledgers, wire transfers, GPS logs, all of it linked to Marcus Stone's businesses. More importantly, it exposed ties to a logistics network suspected of moving shipments for multiple cartels. The farm wasn't just the final piece, it was the crown jewel. From here, they could move product north, tap into rail lines, bypass federal checkpoints, and disappear into Canada. Jack scanned the files and saw the truth. This wasn't just a local operation. Stone's been building a corridor for years, buying land, bribing officials, eliminating threats, and this farm is the keystone. David tapped the screen. They're getting desperate. That's why they're showing force. If they lose this property, their entire distribution chain collapses. Jenny Thompson arrived mid-afternoon with bruises on her jaw and fire in her eyes. "They jumped me on the way home, said it was a warning." She didn't need to say who they were. She tossed a bloody bandana onto the table. "You want proof? There's your DNA." Jack picked it up carefully. "We'll get it tested. This gives us probable cause to involve federal agents. It won't be ignored." But that night, something changed. The game shifted again. The Steel Riders didn't send another convoy. They didn't torch another property. They went silent. Radio traffic dropped. Drone surveillance vanished. The compound, according to David's infrared, went dark. "They're up to something," he muttered, eyes locked on the screen. "This isn't retreat. This is concealment." Maria's phone buzzed. A single text from an anonymous source. "Storm coming. 24 hours." Jack looked at the message and said what everyone else was thinking. They're planning a full-scale hit, not just pressure, not just threats, a coordinated strike. Linda confirmed the warning an hour later. "We intercepted a burner phone conversation. They're bringing in outside teams, former PMC cartel-affiliated contractors, armed. They're calling it cleanup." Rose didn't flinch. "Then we clean first." That night, the farm transformed. Lights off, generators running silent, entry points sealed. Community members, those who had quietly pledged to help, took up positions around the perimeter. Old hunters with scoped rifles, retired deputies with radios and maps, farmers who knew how to shoot because they'd been hunting since they were 10. It wasn't a militia. It wasn't a rebellion. It was a town saying, "Not here, not now, not again." Jack walked the line with David, checking positions, whispering instructions, fine-tuning defenses. At each post he met the same expression: quiet resolve, steady hands, people with everything to lose, and finally something worth fighting for. When the sun rose over the hills, the wind shifted. The air tasted different. Distant engines echoed from the west, too many to be a coincidence. Linda's voice came over the radio, tight and controlled. "Convoy confirmed. Moving fast. 8 vehicles, tactical pattern, ETA 20 minutes. Jack's voice was steel. "Positions. No one fires unless I say. But if they cross the fence, we end it." At the heart of the farm, Rose sat calmly in her rocking chair, tea at her side, shotgun across her lap. She wasn't just bait. She was the beginning and end of this fight. The one person Marcus Stone couldn't buy, couldn't scare, couldn't silence. And when that convoy came over the hill, Whispering Pines didn't cower. It waited, armed, ready, because in the face of shadows there is only one defense: light, and they were about to shine it. It began before the sun had fully slipped below the horizon. The last orange rays stretched long across the fields of Miller Farm, throwing long shadows over fence posts and freshly turned soil. The world looked quiet, peaceful, but every soul on that land knew what was coming. There were no speeches, no prayers, just the collective breath of a town standing on the edge of something that would change everything. Jack stood near the barn, radio at his shoulder, eyes on the ridgeline where the tree line thinned. Beside him, David checked the last of the sensor relays. The air was thick with tension, and even the wind seemed to hesitate. They came in silence, not with roaring engines or flashing lights, but like predators, Calculated, surgical, confident. 6 vehicles at first, then more. Black SUVs fanned out across the dirt road leading to the property, positioning themselves with tactical precision. These weren't the rough, patched-up bikes of a biker gang. These were government-grade transports, heavily armored, tinted glass, no markings. They didn't just scream money, they whispered danger. Inside the farmhouse, Rose moved through her kitchen with the same calm she'd had every morning for the past 70 years. The kettle whistled. She poured her tea. She placed it gently on her saucer and walked to the front room, shotgun already leaning against the window frame. She didn't tremble, didn't blink. She just watched. Because some things didn't change, even when the world outside threatened to burn down. The first move wasn't a charge. It was a setup. From the trees on the eastern ridge, 2 small squads broke away from the convoy and moved toward the property perimeter. Fast, silent, communicating with hand signals. But as soon as the first boot crossed the boundary wire, a soft chime rang in David's earpiece. "Eastfield, 3 o'clock. We've got movement. 5 targets." Jack tapped his radio twice. Go time. The floodlights kicked on. Every corner of the property lit up like a stadium. A dozen motion-triggered beams roared to life, flooding the fields with white-hot clarity. It caught the mercenaries mid-stride, like deer on an open road. For a second, they hesitated, just long enough, because by the time they regrouped, Jack was already on the move. "David, redirect camera feeds to cloud. Maria needs this live." "Already on it," came the reply. The East team faltered when their radios turned to static. David's jammers worked perfectly, scrambling their comms and breaking their coordination. Jack flanked wide, fast, low to the ground, slipping through the tall grass like a shadow. He didn't fire, not yet. He waited until they made their next mistake. And they did. One of them reached for the fence post to scale it, didn't see the micro tripwire strung just beneath the top rail. When he did, it was too late. A deafening bang erupted as a flash charge detonated, blinding and disorienting the entire unit. They scattered, stumbling back into the open field. Now it was time. Shots cracked through the air, not from Jack, but from the tree line. Local hunters, old vets, and a few stubborn sons of ranchers who refused to let strangers take their land. They fired low, controlled, taking out legs, not lives. These weren't killers, they were defenders. The Steel Riders' hired guns fell back, dragged their wounded, returned fire in short, angry bursts. But the defenders were already repositioning, moving like ghosts from one patch of cover to the next. Back at the house, Rose lifted her shotgun, aimed down the barrel at a second squad approaching from the north. They moved fast, cutting through the pasture near the irrigation ditch, but they didn't see the trench. Jack had dug it 3 nights ago, covered it in canvas, disguised it with hay. The first 2 men dropped straight in. The rest froze, just long enough for the porch lights to flare. Rose squeezed the trigger. The blast echoed across the field, and one of the mercenaries dropped, clutching his side. She didn't wait to see where the others ran. She reloaded calmly and waited. Inside the barn, David monitored the feeds. "West flank trying to breach the gate. 5 men, bolt cutters, moving quick." Jack's voice cut in. "Engage non-lethal. Time to scare them stupid." From inside a rusted tractor, a concealed speaker crackled to life, blaring an air horn at 120 decibels. Simultaneously, automated floodlights blasted on from behind, casting the attackers' own shadows long and ominous across the dirt. It was enough to shake even seasoned professionals. They dropped the cutters and scattered, not realizing 2 of their number had already been caught on hidden cameras. Faces exposed, gear tagged. Maria was watching from her remote setup in town, capturing it all, sending encrypted backups to multiple contacts. The story was writing itself. The final group, Stone's core unit, approached from the south, shielded by the terrain, thinking they had the element of surprise. What they didn't know was that Linda Cooper and her 2 most trusted deputies had taken position in the old grain silo overlooking the South Trail. When the group reached the lower fence, Linda gave the order. Flares shot into the air. Red smoke covered the ground. The attackers froze. They were boxed in. Sightlines compromised, exits covered, radio silence still in effect. One of them panicked, fired a shot into the air. That was their final mistake. Within seconds, spotlights from 2 parked pickups lit them up, and they were staring down the barrels of half a dozen rifles held by men and women with nothing left to lose and no intention of backing down. Slowly, one by one, the attackers dropped their weapons, hands raised, face pale. The surrender wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was desperate. The kind that came from professionals who suddenly realized they'd been outmaneuvered, not by soldiers, but by townsfolk who refused to go quietly. Jack rounded up the stragglers himself. He zip-tied their hands, checked for weapons, and brought them to the barn, where David documented everything: photos, dog tags, serial numbers. One of the mercenaries spat blood and muttered, "We didn't sign up for this." Jack stared him down. "You signed up for a paycheck. You got a reckoning." By sunrise, the Steel Riders operation had collapsed. Not a single round had been fired from Jack or David's rifles. No one had died, but every single attacker had either fled, surrendered, or been incapacitated. And more importantly, every moment had been recorded, every move catalogued, every face captured. Maria uploaded the footage in segments to 3 major outlets, and by the time the second cup of coffee hit the burner in Bill Anderson's diner, news trucks were already on the way. But it was too late for the Riders, too late for Marcus Stone, too late for Bennett, because now the world knew. The small town of Whispering Pines had stood its ground, and a storm of truth was coming for the men who had thought it never would. The dust hadn't even settled on the roads around Whispering Pines when the real shockwaves began. Not the kind that came from boots on the ground or bullets in the night, but the ones born from exposure, the kind that ripped through polished offices and hidden boardrooms. That morning, as the sun climbed over the ridges and touched the Miller farm with warm gold, something far colder was unfolding elsewhere, in state capitals, in newsrooms, in federal buildings where silence had been bought and paid for, until now. Maria Santos's story hit the wire at 6:03 a.m. sharp, a full investigative exposé, complete with leaked footage, documents, affidavits, and a digital breadcrumb trail that led straight from the Steel Riders compound to high-ranking officials, state contracts, and shell companies laundering millions. The video of the attempted siege on Miller Farm, clear as day with timestamps and faces, was already trending nationally by breakfast. The footage of Rose Miller calmly sitting on her porch, shotgun across her lap as trained mercenaries backed down, became the image of resistance. One still photo in particular, a wide shot of the farm bathed in floodlight, surrounded by townsfolk in denim and flannel, armed and defiant, went viral in less than an hour. The headline beneath it was simple: "When the government fails, the people don't." In Helena, phones rang off the hook. Thomas Bennett, the county commissioner who had threatened Rose, disappeared before noon. When agents from the Office of the Inspector General arrived at his office with a federal subpoena, they found an empty desk and a shredded laptop. But it was too late. Maria's documents had already exposed every wire transfer he'd authorized, every land deal he'd approved, every luxury account he thought was buried offshore. That same morning, 3 state senators were served with sealed indictments, and a 4th resigned for health reasons before noon. At the Steel Riders compound, chaos reigned. Those who hadn't fled were in hiding. Their communications infrastructure was in pieces. Servers seized, hard drives copied, security logs hacked and uploaded to open-source networks. Anonymous hackers from across the country joined in, tracking the Riders' operations, doxing their allies, and exposing their global connections in real time. Jack didn't even have to lift a finger. The truth had taken on a life of its own. But the backlash wasn't just political or digital. It was deeply personal. Rose received nearly 2,000 letters in 3 days. Veterans wrote from across the country, many of them strangers, calling her a symbol of strength. Former whistleblowers who had been silenced by fear found her address and thanked her for standing tall when they couldn't. Families in rural towns who'd endured the same kind of quiet intimidation sent photos of their own farms, their own porches, their own stories. And with each letter, Rose didn't grow proud. She grew more resolved. Because this fight, she realized, had never been just about her land. It had always been about showing people that the only thing needed to break fear was one person standing still when everyone else ran. Sheriff Linda Cooper was reinstated officially and offered a commendation by the U.S. Marshal Service. She declined the spotlight but accepted the resources, extra personnel, new equipment, and full federal support. Her first order of business was to rehire the 2 deputies she could trust and start rebuilding the department from the ground up. She swore in 3 new recruits, all local. One was Mike Foster's niece. Another was a mechanic who had fought off a mercenary with nothing but a wrench and his nerve. The third had once been arrested for trespassing, back when the law was still owned by people like Bennett. Jack and David were offered contracts, consulting positions with federal agencies, operational command roles, even book deals. They turned them all down, because they weren't done. Whispering Pines had won the battle, but war left scars, and cleanup was far from over. Instead, they stayed, quietly, unofficially. They helped wire the sheriff's new comms room with encrypted channels. They taught self-defense classes at the high school gym. They trained the town's volunteer watch in basic surveillance and crisis response. And every morning they met on Rose's porch, coffee in hand, boots in the dirt, eyes on the horizon, because there was still work to do. One morning, a letter arrived with no return address. Inside was a single line. "You've disrupted operations in 5 states. That's a problem." No signature, no threat, just fact. Jack read it twice before burning it. David, when told, simply said, "Let them come." But even the cartel, the real puppet masters behind Marcus Stone, had begun to fracture. Stone, arrested and held in a high-security federal facility, tried to bargain, offered names, routes, contacts. But the feds already had what they needed: the footage, the confessions, the financial trails. It was airtight. Stone's empire crumbled faster than anyone had expected. And his cartel contacts? They didn't offer him protection. They put a price on his head, because the one thing more dangerous than betrayal was visibility, and Stone had brought too much of both. Word spread quietly through certain circles that Whispering Pines was no longer a soft target, that the little mountain town in Montana had become a symbol, a warning, a problem. But for the people who lived there, it became something else entirely. The town's storefronts reopened, slowly. Jenny Thompson rebuilt her shop with help from neighbors and donated supplies from across the country. Mike Foster expanded his garage, now offering free repairs to first responders and veterans. Bill Anderson remodeled the diner's back room into a memorial wall, not for the fallen, but for the survivors. Photos, news clippings, letters of thanks, a timeline of resistance, pride, and grit. And as for Rose, she never left the farm. She planted that spring like she always did, tilled the soil, fed the chickens, hung wind chimes back on the porch post where they used to sway. Her rhythm didn't change, but her legacy had. She was no longer just a farmer or a grandmother. She was a cornerstone, a name whispered across state lines, across agencies, across movements, proof that you didn't need youth or wealth or firepower to change the course of something bigger than yourself. You just needed a spine of steel and a front porch with a view. Whispering Pines would never be the same. It had been broken, tested, threatened, and still stood. It had faced wolves in suits and soldiers for hire. And it hadn't just survived. It had drawn a line that echoed far beyond its borders. And now the world was listening,